Good morning, everyone. This is Father Nate, missionary priest in Italy, and thanks for joining us today, November 18th, on No Greater Delight, our podcast on Marian feasts and Marian meditations. Well, today we have two celebrations. First, near Bourges in France, Our Lady of Bordeaux, an abbey built in 928 for the Benedictines. But probably the more well-known feast, and certainly more important if you're in Venezuela, is the Rosary Virgin of Chiquinquira. Now, this Chiquinquira in Venezuela is not to be confused with the Colombian devotion of the same name, because that one refers to a different apparition and is celebrated July 9th. No, in Maracaibo, in Venezuela, on the morning of November 18th, 1709, a group of women were beginning their daily work of washing clothes in the lake of Maracaibo. One of the women saw through the waves a small piece of wood, which she took, thinking it would serve as a lid for a jar of water. But when she brought it home, she noticed that it started changing colors. And as she cleaned it, religious images began to appear. She then put it in a special place, and shortly thereafter, lights and sounds came from the image. A complete image of Our Lady emerged. And interestingly enough, a Lady of our image as mestiza, so a mix between the European and indigenous peoples, and she had a native face. So for today's reading from True Devotion to Mary by St. Louis de Montfort, we're continuing with part 2 on the most excellent devotion to our Blessed Lady, or the perfect consecration to Jesus by Mary. And we're in this sort of like transition or bridge, we could say, considering the figure of this consecration of, to Jesus through Mary, in the history of Jacob receiving the blessing of Isaac through the offices of Rebekah. So earlier, yesterday that is, we heard St. Louis de Montfort compare Esau with the reprobate. And he says this is what Esau did. He was strong, but he only trusted in himself. He never stayed at home, and he only worked out of doors. And then the saint is going through comparing that with the reprobate, the people who, he says, aren't going to make it to heaven. And so we'll continue. If you remember the third point, he said, Esau took very little pains to please his mother Rebekah, and indeed did nothing for that end. And so on point 188, he comments on that. He says, the reprobate cared next to nothing for devotion to our Blessed Lady, the mother of the predestinate. It is true that they do not hate her formally. Indeed, they sometimes praise her and say they love her, and even practice some devotion in her honor. Nevertheless, they cannot bear that we should love her tenderly, because they have not the tenderness of Jacob for her. They find much to say against the practices of devotion, in which her good children and servants faithfully employ themselves in order to gain her affection, because they do not think that devotion necessary to salvation. And they consider that provided they do not hate Our Lady formally, or openly despise her devotion, it is enough. Moreover, they imagine that they are already in her good graces, and that, in short, they are his servants, inasmuch as they recite and mumble certain prayers in her honor, without tenderness for her or amendment in themselves. The fourth point, this is going to be 189, it's commenting on Esau was such a glutton and loved eating so much that he sold his birthright for a mess of pottage. The reprobates sell their birthright, that is, the pleasures of paradise. They sell it for a pottage of lentils, that is to say, for the pleasures of the earth. They laugh, they drink, they eat, they amuse themselves, they gamble, they dance, and take no more pains than Esau did to render themselves worthy of the benediction of their heavenly Father. In a word, they think only of earth, and they love earth only. And they speak and act only for earth and for its pleasures, selling for one moment of enjoyment, one vain puff of honor, and for one morsel of hard metal, white or yellow, their baptismal grace, their robe of innocence, and their heavenly inheritance. And then, for the fifth comment, it's he was like Cain, full of envy against his brother Jacob, and persecuted him beyond measure. And so, at point 190, commenting on that, St. Louis de Montfort says, finally, the reprobate daily hate and persecute the predestinate openly and secretly. They feel the predestinate as a burden to them. They despise them. They criticize them, they counterwork them, they abuse them, they rob them, they cheat them, they impoverish them, they drive them away, they bring them low into the dust. While they themselves are making fortunes, are taking their pleasures, getting themselves into good positions, enriching themselves, aggrandizing themselves, and living at their ease.
Thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoyed our Marian podcast. As St. John Paul II teaches us, from Mary we learn to love Christ, her Son, the Son of God. Through her intercession, may we grow ever closer to Him. We encourage you to share this with a loved one or friend and help spread our devotion to Mary. Thank you, and God bless.